2019 for student housing, America's darling for investment niches these days, is going to have some look the same and some look different in 2019. Let's start with investment sales. In investment sales, we expect it to be very much like 2018, somewhere in the $8 to $10 billion range of sales, largely driven by how much product can be brought to market and be available for purchase. Because in student housing, there's way more buyers of properties than there are sellers. So what comes to market will dictate volume. We think 8 to 10 billion again this year for the third year in a row in student housing. As it relates to university enrollments, look for an uptick in enrollments to start in 2019 and continue on over the next couple of years at a higher rate than they have in the recent past. And finally, on the construction horizon, good news is on the horizon. For the first time since the Great Recession in 2010, deliveries are going to be less than 40,000 beds in the student housing sector, which peaked in the mid-60,000s just a couple of years ago. That should temper the new supply. That should further strengthen markets. So on the construction delivery front, a good outlook for fall of 19 compared to the recent past. Looking into 2019, property values and cap rates for student housing we see as holding steady. And that's going to contrast, I believe, with the other sectors of commercial real estate, with the pressures of rising interest rates and top of cycle values. We're seeing thoughts of increasing cap rates and decreasing property values in other sectors. We don't see that in student housing because of supply and demand, more buyers than there are sellers. And with a recession on the horizon, we're a recession-resistant asset class, so naturally more capital would want to move into student housing with this specific timing, so that should bolster values as well. Yes, investors are still compensated with higher cap rates and higher IRRs, internal rates of return, in student housing than you do see in other sectors of commercial real estate. However, the spreads have narrowed, showing the popularity of student housing compared to other asset classes. Nevertheless, you are compensated as an investor with higher returns still today in student housing. And one of them is the lease-up cycle. Unlike multifamily, which lease apartments every month, student housing has a pre-leasing cycle that leads to the fall move-in. So yes, there is a difference in leasing between conventional housing and student housing. But if that's a perceived risk, it's mitigated by a strong management team that knows how to lease in that cycle. And it's also mitigated by the defensive nature of the student housing space. In our space, we're correlated on the upside with the economy. In a growing economy, returns are good and performance is good and occupancy is good in student housing. But in a down cycle, when our sister asset classes don't do quite as well, student housing does even better. So that's how you mitigate the risk. It's a diversifier and you have a defensive asset class. The intermediate term outlook for student housing has never been brighter. Allocations to real estate as an asset class have been increasing in recent years from an average of 8% to now 10% of a portfolio. And with a recession on the horizon, we believe that even more capital is going to be looking towards student housing and other non-correlated asset classes, senior housing, medical office, the so-called niche sectors of commercial real estate, more now than ever, given the timing in the cycle. So that bodes very, very well looking forward for student housing. Asset allocation to student housing has been evolving. Historically, exposure to student housing has come from allocating into multifamily, and that going into multifamily funds that in part invest in student housing. Going forward, more and more institutions are earmarking an allocation, either for other, the niche asset classes, or specifically to student housing. And that's a big changing dynamic as investors target student housing on a very specified basis and look to identify operating partners who can execute that allocation decision.